Jerry, over to you.
Yes, I'm here. Okay, I'm here. I wish you all a good evening. Actually, for me, it's a afternoon, so just after 1 o'clock here. But over there, I guess you guys have had dinner, and now it's evening. So I want to share with you my experience, my career with NASA, and my career is ongoing. I haven't retired yet. I've been here 55 years. I'm going into my 56th year, and I don't plan on retiring anytime soon. I'm going to try to at least make 60 years. So the talk I want to share with you today is a different approach I've taken, and I hope those three gentlemen behind me will appreciate what I'm going to share because I'm going to talk about their experience with Apollo 13. Now, that's not really Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes and Jack Swigert. That's the crew of the movie Apollo 13. And that movie is real special to me because of that movie, there's great interest in Apollo 13. In fact, when the movie was produced, Ron Howard and Tom Hanks sent me this hat here. This hat is a Apollo 13 hat, and I did a lot of interviews to share the great job they did on the movie. But I want to talk about my career, and I want to treat it sort of like a time capsule. Now, this would be a time capsule. I bury it in the yard or Johnson Space Center, and then you dig it up. And in it, I have my experiences. So I opened it up and I looked in the time capsule, and what I found here, this is my first badge that NASA signed me when I came to work June 14th of 1965. And when I came on board, they assigned me the switches and gauges of the Apollo spaceships for both the command ship and the lunar lander. And besides that, they included something called the Command Module Caution and Warning System. Now, I'd gone to Rice University and I had a degree in electrical engineering, and I had taken very heady courses like field theory and thermodynamics and circuit theory and all that. And then I was assigned switches and gauges. And I was disappointed. I said, wow, uh, you know, switches and gauges. Well, they soon took switches and gauges and gave it to another engineer, but they left me with the alarm system. I guess because nobody really wanted the alarm system. That was my role, the alarm system. Now that was in 1965, so I was 22 years old. And here I was responsible for actually what President Kennedy had said in Congress. He had said, I will that we should send to the moon a man and then return him safely to the earth. So that's me. I'm supposed to be responsible for returning that man, those astronauts, safely to the earth. So to do that, I began to visit with engineers and astronauts, and they would come by my desk, and I tried to understand everything I could about this ship that would take astronauts to the moon. For Apollo 11, it's called the Columbia. And then, excuse me, my models are a little bit, primitive. This is actually a pencil sharpener, but, it serves to show you what the lunar lander looked like. So these two ships, they required someone to be responsible for alerting the astronauts if there was an imminent threat that might either cause their mission to fail or actually could even take their lives. So in that role, I began to travel around the United States, and I would go to the manufacturers of the lunar lander, as well as the manufacturer in North America and in the West Coast in Los Angeles. And I would visit with the people that actually managed construction. This was a big job. I mean, it wasn't done by NASA alone. NASA had to work with people in industry that actually had a lot of hands-on experience with building these ships. And so in one visit, I went out to North America, and this was in July of 1966, and they were having a final meeting to review the status of the mothership that would actually take astronauts to the moon. So at this meeting, being responsible for the alarm system, they had a final review. Now, the day of that final review, I had met by an astronaut by the name of Roger Chaffee. And Roger Chaffee, Gus Grissom, and Ed White were going to actually be in this vehicle for not to go to the moon, but actually to test it in a orbit around the Earth. And so Roger and I had discussed the alarm system, and he and I had come up with some ideas to make it better. But at that review that evening, here was Roger, Gus, Ed White, our three first Apollo astronauts, and we decided, the group did, it reviewed all this, that we would ship that particular spacecraft, it's called Spacecraft 12, to Cape Kennedy, and there it would be prepared to launch. Well, I went home from that meeting back to Houston, Texas, and I was in January 27th of 1967, how many, that would be about 5 months later, I was having dinner and the TV was on, and I heard in my ears, they've had a problem at Cape Kennedy with the spaceship during tests. And Roger Chaffee, Ed White, and Gus Grissom, they had perished in a horrible fire on the launch pad. What a devastating thing that was for me and all of us that had tried to do a good job, but we really hadn't done a very good job. And I wondered about the alarm system. Why hadn't it saved them? Well, yes, it came on, but because of what we called nuisance alarms during that afternoon, it was like the boy crying wolf, you know, it kept coming on, so they began to not pay a lot of attention to it. But had it even come on, there was no fire extinguisher on board to put out a fire. A short circuit had actually the atmosphere, pure oxygen atmosphere in the cabin, such that in just seconds, it took the lives of Roger, a young man that I had come to know and appreciate, Ed White, and then Gus Grissom. They were three of our most significant astronauts, and they gave their lives to go to the moon. Well, that resulted in a big change within how NASA managed the Apollo program. One of the things that happened, Gus Grissom, because of their death and so forth, there was a manager named George Lowe, Dr. George Lowe, who was placed in charge of the entire Apollo spacecraft program. And he thought, you know, we have wonderful flight controllers, we have highly trained astronauts, but we need another group. We need a group of engineers that actually have tested all these systems, have designed them, have worked through how they're installed in the vehicle. People that, if we have a difficult problem, we can go to them, mission control, the astronauts can go to them for things that are just very unique and very complicated, because these are the guys that can pull out the drawings and find where every wire went, and they can be our last source of information. If we can't come up with something the astronauts and the flight controllers can figure out, we'll go to these guys. Well, they called that group the Mission Evaluation Room, the MER. Now, I really like and see it as something called the Mission Engineering Control Room. You know, there is something called the Mission Operations Control Room, is known as the MOCR. Well, my name for where I was put as the alarm system engineer was the Mission Engineering Control Room, because we had to go into the depth and the design and so forth. When there was a problem that they couldn't quickly come up with a solution, and we would be the ones that would have to come up with it and feed it into the astronauts and flight control. Well, okay, so here we are. I had, because of Apollo 1, because of the fire, they had decided we need to look at the alarm system and redesign it, because we have to make sure that the alarm system for the lunar lander and the alarm system for the command ship will work perfectly so that astronauts will always have a warning. And so that became my principal job, to be responsible for the team that would actually evaluate the alarms and change them and improve them. And so I would go and visit with all the managers, the power manager, the command module communications manager, the environmental control system manager. And I'd say, what's the best way to tell the astronauts in flight control that you have a problem? And so in the process of doing that, I would take trips to the manufacturer of the lunar lander. I'd take trips to the manufacturer of the command module. And in those trips, I would review with the engineers what was the best way to make sure that astronauts were safe. I remember on one of these trips that I went, I thought about when the astronauts actually were walking on the moon. And I had the idea, I said, well, what if they're walking on the moon and for some reason an alarm comes on and they'd have to cut short their spacewalk because there was a sensor in the lunar lander that detected the temperature of the lunar surface. And the actual trip level or the threshold that would turn that thing on, I said, why don't you guys run a thermal analysis and make sure that that sensor does not get at a temperature that is going to ring an alarm while Neil Armstrong is walking on the moon. They did an analysis and found out that would happen. So, you know, here you're looking at a guy that perhaps saved the moonwalk, because if that alarm would have come on, they'd have had to cut the moonwalk short, and the astronauts couldn't even have talked to President Nixon, you know, with the flag there that they had stood on the moon. So that's one of my best contributions that happened many years ago, but I always share it with my audience. Probably the best thing I ever did in my entire 55 career year. And I must have saved my entire NASA salary for the last 55 years on that one idea. So, by the way, I appreciate talking to you folks in England, because basically Welch forebears for me came over to the United States in the Woodfills, my name Woodfill. They came over and they became circuit riding preachers for the Methodist Church in the United States. So that's my origin. My origin is from Wales. And it's interesting because I have two real good friends that they and I enjoy dealing with and looking back in history on Apollo, and especially things involved with the mission evaluation room. And these guys are wonderful. We email each other almost daily sometimes. And Craig Scott is one of them. He lives in Wales, not too far from the Space Center that you have. And then Colin Fitton. And these guys are wonderful because they really appreciate Apollo. And all the English, you know, you guys, I really appreciate the English because you guys are giving voice to these things in a way that I could never have done. In fact, recently the Telegraph newspaper had in their magazine, they interviewed me for a story, kind of the story I'm telling you now. And Sky at Night, what is that? I think that's your astronomy magazine. It did another interview. I really appreciate you folks because you have given me voice, even though it took 55 years, but thank God for y'all. And so, okay, here we are on Apollo 11. We're going to the moon, and I've looked over the warning system, and we separate from the mothership and the lunar lander. They called it, remember, the Eagle, and it's coming down towards Tranquility Base. And all of a sudden, my alarm system starts ringing alarms. It's called the program alarm. 1201, 1202 were the numeric designations. It starts ringing these alarms. And I'm thinking, I reviewed all these alarms and I tried to eliminate what we call nuisance alarms. And these are alarms that come on because you flip a switch. And if you put it in the actual operations checklist and you flip a switch and you expect it, that's fine, because the astronaut knows it was just because of a momentary transient that caused that alarm. And so we're coming down towards Tranquility Base, and this nuisance alarm, 1201, 1202, starts coming on. And I'm thinking, I had never alerted the astronauts about that. You know, I had put together a memorandum that I sent to the people that put together all the instructions for Neil Armstrong when he was going down to land on the moon concerning the alarm system. And when he turned it on in my instructions, I said, you'll see certain alarms come on because that's expected. But I had never reviewed in depth the guidance system such that I had come up with knowing that. But fortunately, Gene Kranz and Jack Garman and guys in flight control, 2 weeks before the actual landing, had one of the simulation guys had said he had put that in as one of the nuisance alarms. And during that simulation, Steve Bales is another fellow. He was on console when they landed. Bales actually aborted during the simulation. And as a result of that, Jack Garman went back and listed every single one of those 1201 and 1202 program alarms. And because of Jack and then Gene Kranz and others in flight control, when that 1201 and 1202 alarm came on, they said, press on, press on. It came on 5 times. And had they not gone over that, you might be looking at the guy that would have gone down in infamy as having kept Neil Armstrong off the moon, but for those wonderful flight controllers and the thorough job that they gave and did. Okay, so we made it down to the moon surface, and when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were after walking about, there wasn't any what we call a landing radar temperature alarm that would have turned on and aborted their moonwalk. So yeah, that was one thing I did right during Apollo 11. But here we are now. We went back to the moon on Apollo 12, worked pretty well, except that, Conrad and Bean were going to come down. And of all things, as they launched, they were struck by lightning. That's not too good a thing. That'll ruin your day if you're launching to the moon and your ship is struck by lightning. But John Aaron, a very bright flight controller, had actually had a situation prior to that. And he simply said, flip this switch and everything restored itself. It's like your iPhone, resetting your iPhone and recycling it, and it worked fine. And so John saved Apollo 12. But here we were, Apollo 13, 55 hours and 55 minutes into the mission. I was in the mission evaluation room, headset on, and I was looking at the display, and this is what I saw. We were a very primitive group. That we just would see these TV sets. They were 16-inch TV, black and white TV sets. Now the flight controllers, they had these real fancy earphones and their console and so forth, and they each had an individual console. But we had to share these 6 television sets that were along the wall of the mission evaluation room, and in order to see them, my eyes were pretty good then. I was a young guy. But some of the guys that were more up in years, they had to use binoculars to actually see the measurements. And so this is what it looked like then in that day. If you can see this picture, you see that that's me in that one picture, and that's what I look like. It's terrible what the ravages of time do to the human body, but that's what I once looked like. And so it was 55 hours and 55 minutes into the mission, and I was looking at that console, and all of a sudden it started to flicker, 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 flicker. And a moment later, I heard in my headset, Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main bus B undervolt. And I thought, main bus B undervolt, that's one of my alarms. And what had happened was the explosion had indirectly taken the voltage down on that main bus B, which I had set the threshold that would turn on an alarm at about 26.5 or 25.5 volts. And it actually was the first warning, except of course for the explosion. But really the explosion, they didn't really make that big a thing about it. Fred Hayes would often say that I had been flicking something called the replace valve, and it would throw out a little popping noise. And so Lovell and Schweikert thought that Fred was playing sort of a trick on him, and he was flipping that valve when it was really an actual explosion. And pretty soon, when that alarm came on, the master alarm, they heard in their headset, That was the noise they heard, and they knew that it was a real problem. It was the main bus B undervolt, and soon the fuel cells were going out. The explosion by the hand. I make a big thing about this. A lot of this story that I tell about Apollo 13, I can list 13 different things that I can't explain, except it has to be, people call it luck, but I call it God's providence. Here's one of them. When the explosion happened, it was a tank in the service module. The O2 was a cryogenic, liquid oxygen tank, and it was the outside perimeter of the service module. And inside was the O2-1 tank. Now, the whole mechanism of what caused it to fail was during the time that tank was installed in Apollo 13, for some reason, one of the bolts was not loose, and the lift thing lifted up, and then it came back down and shocked it. And so the shock actually caused damage to O2 tank 2. Now, had tank 1 been shocked, and the problem hadn't tank 1, they would have died, because that manifested itself, that shock, in that electrical wire eventually causing the explosion of Apollo 13. Had it been tank 1, the experience would have been devastating, because it would have taken out tank 1, tank 2, and over them were the liquid hydrogen tanks, and they would have all been involved, and Apollo 13 would just be a comet. And you think it's some, it would have never, they'd have all died almost instantly. So what happened was, you all, I know, have seen the movie. I want to encourage everybody to see the movie. Wonderful movie. A lot of it's, there's just a little small part of it that's not quite correct. And what kind of aggravates me is the part that's not quite correct deals with the two things that I think the mission evaluation room really contributed to the rescue. One of, if you've seen in the movie, you've seen the scene where they didn't have enough round filters to work in the rescue ship. They had plenty of the square filters from this ship, 24 of these, but they wouldn't work properly. The square filters wouldn't fit in the round system. And so I always share this thing, and this is my demonstration. I give about 65 of these talks a year, but since the COVID situation, I've not been giving any live talks. So I'm going to do this real quick for you guys, and it's my demonstration. And so how do you make this square filter? That's the filter for the mothership, work in the barrel for the round filter. That's my oil filter, kind of simulates a round filter from the rescue ship, the lunar lander. How do you make this thing, the square filter, work in the round barrel? Well, they called the mission evaluation room. And there we have the environmental control designers, the systems guys that actually came up with all this and this. And so a guy named Ed Smiley, they called him in and said, Ed, what do we do? We don't have enough of these round filters to filter the atmosphere to save their lives ultimately. What do we do? Well, Ed, he began to think, and as he's driving over to the Space Center, he gets this idea. He knows on board there are these hoses, and he knows that these hoses, the outlet of one of the fans in the ship blows the cabin atmosphere through that hose. And he thought, if I can use that fan and that hose, and I can circulate the cabin atmosphere with that fan through that hose, and I can actually take that square filter and surround it with bags. They had bags on board for moon rocks and other things. And I can take that, where did I put my filter? It's somewhere. Where are you, square filter? That's one thing when you have all these props and here it is in my hand. Okay, if I can take that square filter and use that bag, and then I can, somehow bring that hose into that bag, and I can, I'm the fan. Okay, and I can blow the air through that bag, but it's going to leak. It's going to leak. And then it thinks, if we have duct tape on board, I know I can save their lives. And guess what? They had duct tape on board, and that duct tape was used to save the lives, because now they could make that thing sealed up. They could duct tape around the opening, and it worked perfectly. And of course, I go out and give a lot of these talks. And so when I give these talks, I have a song I wrote about duct tape, and it basically is about Apollo 13, where their spaceship exploded 200,000 miles in space, and too few round CO2 filters meant death was in their face. Now the damaged mothership had plenty that were square, but how you make a square filter fit into a round hole was their prayer. So they looked around that spaceship to find a way, and found something that just might work that day. No rocket science needed for this device. An old roll of duct tape would work very nice. You got to use what you have faith and believe, because the plain things in life are all free to receive. Failure's no option when problems show up. If simple things will help us thank God for everyday stuff. So that's my duct tape song. And thank God for it. It saved the crew of Apollo 13. There's still one more thing I want to share about the mission evaluation room. And that is the other thing that really had a big impact on saving the lives of the Apollo 13 astronauts. We have two vehicles, and when the explosion occurred and they had to power up the lunar lander to make it work, incidentally, even the fact that when it happened 55 hours in the mission when they were midway between Earth and the moon. It happened at the perfect time. Too much earlier, and we couldn't have saved them because it would taken too long to get them back home to Earth. Had it happened later, when they had separated the lunar lander from the mothership, it wouldn't have been available as a rescue ship, and they would have lost their lives. So when it happened was the beautiful time for it to happen. And so the problem was, though, when it happened and the power in the mothership ebbed, they had to keep the mothership alive because there was information in the guidance computer that they had to transfer over to the computer in the lunar lander so they could use the lunar lander's guidance to get back to Earth. Well, as they were doing that, they said, we're going to have to keep the command ship alive to keep those numbers available. And so what they had to do, because the fuel cells were going, and they had to use what they called the emergency batteries in the command ship. Now, these batteries, you're not supposed to really use them until you're preparing to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. And then because you don't have the fuel cells anymore, what you have to do is, well, I'm not going to get that out. You have to use those batteries to keep the capsule alive. And we depleted them. They're depleted. Now we don't have adequate power to do the entire re-entry, process. And so what are we going to do? Well, there was a pair of mission evaluation room engineers. Again, that's the group I work with. I was the alarm system engineer for that group. And so what they did is they brought that problem to our guys. And we had two engineers. One was for the power system on the lander. The other guy was the power system on the command ship. Now, this man was named Art Campus. He was a Hispanic engineer, electrical engineer from University of Texas. And then Gary Johnson, who was the command module power guy. Gary's a brilliant guy. He is really brilliant, and likewise was Art. And Gary and Art had worked up a procedure, and they had done that a year or more before the actual need for this procedure. And what the procedure was, it simply was a way of jump charging power from the big batteries. They had great big batteries in the descent stage of the lunar lander. And if you could jump charge power, somehow if they could find a wire between the lunar lander and the emergency batteries in the command ship, they could save their entry capsule's power. And so Art and Gary and the Grumman and the North American engineers, this is basically in the movie. I don't think they made a big thing of it in the movie Apollo 13, except they give credit in the movie Apollo 13 to remember the astronaut that replaced Mattingly? That was Jack Swigert. Well, Jack's a wonderful guy, had a brilliant mind, but he didn't come up with the solution that's given to him in the movie. It was the mission evaluation room, Art and Gary and the Gurman and the Rockwell engineers that worked it out. They tried it out in the simulator. It worked perfectly. And because of that, they were able to get back in home alive. So I probably pretty much worn the audience out here. I really appreciate you guys again being my forebears from Wales, and I guess indirectly I'm an Englishman, right? And so I thank God for you guys in England, because you have really made my life so much more fulfilled. And after 55 years, you want to have something, and that's why I don't retire, because it's because of Boundless. Boundless is so wonderful an organization, and I want to thank Rob Eagles. Rob, Eagles, well, that's providential. Eagle and the Eagles landed. You're the man for sure that should have put this program together, and I thank you for it. But at the conclusion of all my talks on Apollo 13 or Apollo, I always conclude with this oath. And I want to make all you folks that are still watching me, I want to make you all honorary Apollo flight controllers. And when I do my meetings live, and now I do them virtually the same way, I always ask my viewers to put their hand over their heart and say after me this pledge. Now, if I were giving this program to you live, I'd give you one of these wristbands, and one side of it says, let's see if I can show it to you, failure is not an option, and the other side says, I have the right stuff. But you guys got it, because if you're listening, you want to know what happened on the way to the moon. And so I'm going to lead you in this particular oath, and you're going to become honorary Apollo flight controllers, okay? So here we go. And what you do is, I'll say it, sort of like in church when you say some creed or something. I'm going to say it, and you say after me. Here we go. I will do my best. I heard you. To achieve success in my goals. I heard you. Neither fear, failure, nor frustration shall overcome me. I am unstoppable, unmovable, unshakable. Failure is not an option. I have the right stuff. I heard that. Y'all got the right stuff. Godspeed to you, and thank you very much for giving me this time to share my life story and about Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. And so we'll simply, for now, close the time capsule till the next time I open it up. Okay, there we go. Bye-bye for you. I'm back to my NASA work.
I hope you can all hear me now. Failure is not an option for me tonight, and I do hope I have the right stuff now and you can hear me okay. Due to the current situation, we are broadcasting from home, so that will explain our little technical glitch at the start there. But more importantly, thank you, Jerry, for sharing your experiences with us this evening. You are a wonder to listen to and hear from tonight. We have had some questions come in, which I'm sure you're all keen to hear answered. So if you're ready, I'll make a start. Do excuse me, as I'll be reading from the tablet right in front of me here. So Jerry, our first one is from Georgia, age 9. She is currently learning about space at school. What did it feel like knowing that Apollo 11 only had 25 seconds of fuel left to land?
Okay, here again, that's an often told situation. Now, your listening to the guy that actually set the alarm that said they had 25 seconds. No, they had over a minute of fuel left. And they always say 20, it sounds so much more urgent when you say 25 seconds. But when we went through the review of all those alarms on Apollo 11 and 13, we felt like we needed to give them a little more opportunity to land than 25 seconds. So really, when that light came on and they said, what is it, descent quantity, I think that it said descent quantity, some said, well, 25 seconds, but really there was a little of a safety zone in there. So it really, you're hearing this, most of you never heard that because in the movie or anything like that, everybody else says 25 seconds. But we that set the alarm system, it was more than a minute left because this thing's called the lunar excursion model. And by excurd means you have to have enough fuel to excurd around. And fortunately, we had a lot more than 25 seconds worth of fuel. In fact, when they first were descending towards Tranquility Base, a friend of mine, Bob Sabley, who's a flight controller, and he was responsible for actually finding the landing site. And for 3 minutes before they land, they didn't exactly know they were. Can you imagine that? So when they discovered where they were, and then they had the confusion of all those program alarms come on, the astronauts, another program alarm. So, they thought, well, should we abort? And then Charlie Duke, friend of mine, was the Capcom then, and he kept saying, press on, press on, go, 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 go. And so Neil, he looks down, and they're coming in like this. Here's the Tranquility Base, and they're coming like this, the lunar lander, and it kind of rotates over, then you can see the landing site, but there's a big boulder field. It's like a football field full of boulders. So then he takes on manual control and fires the descent engine so it goes beyond that boulder field and then gently brings it down and says, Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. So that's the story of the landing. More than 25 seconds, but it makes a great, wonderful, wonderful tale of how urgent it was. Okay. Good question. I appreciate that question.
It sure does. Thank you, Jerry. Georgia, I hope that's answered that for you, and that will sure be a tale to repeat tomorrow at school. So one here from Paul now, Jerry. How real was the movie Apollo 13 drama compared to the real event?
Okay. I give a talk about comparing the movie Apollo 13 to actual events, and they did a wonderful job. I just showed you on the square filters, on the duct tape thing, wonderful job, One thing they missed altogether where they had Ken Mattingly's replacement, Jack Swigert, actually be the one that came up with that charging the entry batteries. That was kind of an exaggeration, but Ken Mattingly and Jack were wonderful astronauts. And can you see me back here? Okay. I'm looking over the backs of the Apollo astronauts. The alarm system was like a virtual astronaut. That is, when things didn't work right, there'd be a red master alarm would come on, and in their headset, they'd hear this loud tone. So you're looking here at a guy kind of was on board the Apollo missions because I was supposed to come up with ways to alert these guys, Jim Lovell, to their problem. Okay, so I can tell you most of the stuff in Apollo 13 is accurate. Probably 80 to 90% is. One thing they left out, I wish they'd have put in there, was the hurricane. There's a hurricane. Hurricane Helen was in the landing site. And that's one of the best, most dramatic things about Apollo 13's reentry. When it came in, the angle of reentry was shallowing. It looked like they were going to actually miss the Earth altogether. And I have a little deal here. Oh, here you are. And this is my Earth and my moon. So there, Apollo 13 is coming back to Earth right here. And the angle is shallowing. That is, it's going above Earth's horizon, and it looks like they're going to miss Earth altogether. And it's really one of the most wonderful stories to ever tell about Apollo 13, because there was a flight controller, and he had to make a decision. There's a hurricane in the landing site. Apollo 13 is shallowing, and they have in the movie a wonderful rendition of, they had to fire the lunar lander's engine a couple of times to bring it back into the re-entry corridor, but there's a point of no return that he has to know whether that shallowing is going to stop or continue. And he really doesn't know if it's going to stop or continue, because we didn't know what was causing the shallowing. They thought, well, maybe it's something venting, but we didn't know what was venting. They checked everything to see if there's some engine firing that's making it go off course, and no one could figure out what it was. Well, a couple of weeks later, they determined that the cooling system from the lunar lander, see, they hadn't used that before, it was putting off a little vapor, and that vapor was just strong enough to make Apollo 13 miss Earth altogether. So at the last moment, Chuck Dietrich, his name is Chuck Dietrich, he decides that the shallowing is going to stop. Now, he doesn't have any clue on why. I often share this story. I got a letter from a school teacher in Pennsylvania a long time after the mission was over. And she said, Mr. Woodford, I'd read a story. I put out this story about the rescue of Apollo 13, and it was in a Christian publication. And she said, Mr. Woodford, I want to share this with you. That day, April 17th of 1970, when they were facing that problem with the shallowing angle, I had a class of kids, and little red-headed Wanda came into the classroom and said, Teacher, I heard on television that even if our astronauts get back, they're going to land in a terrible storm and we'll lose them. What can we do, teacher? What can we do? And the teacher taught Sunday schools once. She says, kids, all we can do now is pray. And do you know that those 13 little kids, they were special kids. They're special education kids. None of them had an IQ above 80, but they were kids that knew how to pray, and they prayed, and the retro officer, all of a sudden within himself, he says, the shallowing's going to, he didn't know why, but the shallowing stopped. And of course it did, because once they separated the lunar lander and that the source of that vapor, the shallowing wouldn't continue. And we had the most accurate landing of the entire Apollo program. Now that's a story that probably few have heard, but it's a great story. I wish it had been in the movie.
That sure was, Jerry. Thank you so much for sharing that one with us as well. I've got one here from Adrian now. What single gadget from today do you wish you had back then, and why?
Duct tape. My friend Colin Fitton, I share a lot of these stories with Colin Fitton and then Craig Scott. And these guys are wonderful. You ought to have them come over to the Rob, to the National Space Center sometime and give their story about what they know about Apollo 13 and 11. They regularly invite, like they've had Jerry Griffin over and other flight controller, Jerry Bostic and so forth, and they'll bring them by. And I stay close to home. I love these virtual talks. I like it. And so Colin writes me the other day, and he emailed and he says, Jerry, I read where they made some changes to Apollo after 13 to make sure it didn't happen again. He said, but Jerry, did they ever make those filters so they were interchangeable, because you could take the square ones and make them work in the round system? Did they ever do that? I mean, you'd have thought, yeah, they do it. So I thought about, well, why didn't we? Well, we didn't have to. Just keep duct tape on board. And that procedure that the mission evaluation room came on with, and we could always use those 24 filters with our procedure and duct tape. So that's something I'm glad we still have.
A great gadget indeed. So, a really lovely one here from Angela. When President Kennedy gave his speech at Rice Stadium, did you ever believe that you'd be part of the team to put the first man on the moon?
Oh, hey, Angela, God's blessing that you asked that question, because I usually share that in my time capsule story, because I was there in Rice Stadium. And when I go out and give my talk on Apollo 11 and 13, I always give a part of President Kennedy's talk. And the first time I was going to do this, they have the actual podium at Space Center Houston. Our Space Center Houston is like your National Space Center. And I was going to give this talk, and I was going to use the presidential seal. And suddenly I got a call from one of the people over at Space Center and said, Jerry, you cannot do that. I said, well, why not? He said, well, only the president of the United States uses his own seal. There's some kind of a regulation that says that others are not to use it. Now, I can't understand that. I've seen many theatric people use it, but I got a government, badge. I don't want to lose my job over it. So I got clever. Here's what I did. If you'll notice, this is a seal of a resident of the United States. It's the residential seal. So whenever I give John Kennedy's talk, I give it as the resident of the United States of America. Yeah, and it changed my life, that message. When he said this, we do this thing, going to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Because that goal will organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're unwilling to postpone, and one that we intend to win. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why he wanted to climb. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it, and the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there, and therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. When President Kennedy said, we do this thing not because it's easy, but because it's hard, that got into my heart, because I had failed differential equations and made the lowest grade ever made at Rice University in differential equations. Basketball-wise, I was the worst player, even on a basketball scholarship from Indiana. And I had the lowest percentage of shooting anybody in Rice University history. I only made one shot in 18 tries. That one shot was actually a pass I threw to my center under the basket at Baylor University. It sailed over his hands into the basket. I made a bad pass. I never scored. And now the president said, we do this thing not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Well, if we could go to the moon, I could overcome my basketball and my differential equation failure and graduate. And I gave up basketball. I focused on studies, and I graduated. And because of John Kennedy, I became what they call the alarm system engineer. And I was the one that had to deal with the most hazardous and dangerous and things that ever been on any adventure, because I was there, and I believe that's providence in my life that I was there to hear that talk from President Kennedy.
Incredible. Thank you so much again, Jerry. You've led such an incredible career, but one from Eric here. If you could have had the opportunity to go on one of the Apollo missions, would you have gone?
Okay. Now you ask about when you're a young person, I like to encourage young people to know that each one of us has a gift. And sometimes that gift, we don't recognize it, or we don't manifest it in a way that we could even understand what the Lord had planned for our lives. Now, how was I wanted to be a professional basketball player. I played in high school and so forth. I had one game in high school against the #1 team in the state of Indiana. I had a miracle game, and based on one game, I made 20 points against the best defensive player ever to play Indiana high school basketball player. This guy held the leading score in the college nation to 12 points. I played against him my senior year in high school in the state tournament. I made 20 points. And the local newspaper took a picture of me and this guy trying to guard me. And he and another guy that were 6'7" tall together, they couldn't even hold me down. It was a miracle game. I was like Spider-Man in jockey shorts. Here's the picture right here. You see that picture? See number 30? That's me. See that guy 6'7" tall. The guy behind him is the best Indiana defensive man in high school history. I made 20 points against him. And that picture was in the sports section and was sent to the coach at Rice University. And it had my statistics. I mean, like 8 of 11 from the field, 4 or 5 free throws. And based on that one game, I was only averaging 10 points a game. I got a full basketball scholarship to Rice University. So you say, what did you want to do with your life? Well, it's better important is to believe that you've got some talent or abilities that you don't even know you got, or there'll be some circumstance that'll come that'll direct the course of your life. And that's what happened to me. That I was in Rice Stadium. It wouldn't have happened if I hadn't played that one ball game. It all happened because of one thing. And I try to share with all the students I speak to, don't ever be discouraged. You can be having a worse academic career than I had. And yet something can happen that will steer your course of your life. And you may not be an astronaut. I never had aspired to be an astronaut, even a flight. I wanted to be an engineer. And that's the thing to look for. What you've been gifted with as a talent that will make a difference, not only for yourself, but everyone. Thanks. Boy, I love these questions. You notice how I segue each time?
Thank you, Jerry. Well, I'll keep the questions coming. So we've got one here now from Jason. Were there any components on Apollo 11 which were made in the UK?
Okay, share that again.
Sorry.
What was
one from Jason now? Were there any components on Apollo 11 which were made in the United Kingdom?
That remain in the United Kingdom? Well,
yes,
I told you the
components made in the UK.
Oh gosh, I'm sure there were. I've given you the best credit of anyone. You've made the United Kingdom through its engineering, its research. I think his name was Bacon. Not only did you invent the fuel cell, but one of your engineers worked on it and perfected it. Could be used on Gemini and Apollo. So I'm sure there's things from Apollo 11. There should be. If they're not, you guys should have some Apollo 11 fuel cells, at least the test pieces of it, some of the early versions of it. And if you guys are responsible for it, and it's just like those square filters that fit in the round hole, at Space Center Houston, like your Space Center, they have actually a little display of those square filters and so forth. You need to get a fuel cell at the National Space Center that, I'm sure NASA can find you one somewhere. You'll write a letter saying, this guy that works for you said that one of the biggest contributions that England ever made to the moon program was the fuel cell. Would there be a spare one around that we could actually display at the National Space Center? Just think of the marquee you could make there, You could have music playing and Kennedy's talk and everything. and Neil Armstrong, the Eagle has landed. And they would say, and why were they able to land? It was because of the English creativity and engineering of the fuel cell. Okay,
Thank you, Jerry.
That was a pretty poor answer, but it made my point, I think.
Oh, no, not at all. So I've got one here from Craig. Can you tell us about the time you had to stand up to your superiors to fight your case?
I share this story. I've got a YouTube. If you guys go out and in Google search, put Jerry space WOODFILL, and then put YouTube, but around my name, put quotes. You'll see all these videos I've done. Well, one of these videos has 13 life's lessons that I learned from Apollo 13. And about every 3 months, the Space Center asked me to talk what we call our interns. These are young engineers and scientists and others that are starting their careers. So they always have me come and share my experience, like I'm doing with you guys. I've got a lot of stories to tell. And so the last time I shared it was December 7th, and it was about those 13 things. Well, one of the 13 things is to speak up when you know you're right. And I've never managed anybody. I've never been any kind of a chief or anything. I've always been an engineer. I tried to do my very best job. And I always believe if you do your very best job, nobody will recognize it, but you've done a good job. And somehow you'll be recognized. And look at me. I never managed anybody. But yet you guys are asking me to tell my story. And, I'm not a famous flight controller or an astronaut or anything. I'm just a small engineer that never managed anybody. Only thing I managed was the alarm system. And so I talk about the alarm system. And this is the mission evaluation. This guy was the head of the mission evaluation room. His name is Don Arabian. And this guy was fearless. My word. If you listed all the guys that were responsible for getting us to the moon, this is one of the top 5 guys. And he was an engineer, but he was responsible. If it didn't work, he'd tell you so. He would not color code anything or he'd tell you the truth. So Don, he was the head, and he often would be interviewed. And, it was kind of embarrassing to let him talk because he would be so forthright. And so when I give my talk sometime, what I do is behind this thing, I've got the kind of talk he'd give. And here's what he'd say. Now, pretend I'm Don, I'm talking to you. Listen, you skeptics. We don't need no fancy consoles. Nope. Don't need to wear ties, sit in any easy chairs, wear expensive headphones, because we got the brain power. Don't diminish us. We designed, built, and tested the spaceships. All their systems, all their parts, all their pieces. We know how they work, so we know how to fix them, even if they're 1,000 miles in space. So you say, we've never heard of you. We don't give a flip. Just ask George Lowe, the head man over the entire Apollo program. He wouldn't let a Saturn V launch until we said, blast off. So you just had a talk from Don. But my point is, I got in because Don was my mentor. I was in a meeting. We had gone all through the design of the alarm system. I had taken trip after trip after trip, been away from my wife, Betty, who, by the way, we've been married as long as I've almost been married. She's down teaching students down the hall here at community college. And so, I went all these trips and we went through all these different alarms and all these nuisance things that we had to fix. So finally, it came the time to present all this to George Lowe. He was the head of the program. He was the guy that created the mission evaluation room that this guy was responsible for. And so I had gone through this. We made our presentation, and I was about to leave, and one of the board members, I won't say exactly who it was, but the board member said, I'm troubled by this. Troubled by it, I thought. We'd been thorough. He says, I'm troubled. I think we ought to just take all this stuff and review it, which really meant redo it, and see what we come up with. And so George Lowe was considering, maybe this should be the thing. And this has never happened before in my career. I don't think has ever happened since. Something got inside of me. I said, I've got to speak out. This is an injustice. If I don't say something, all that work and all that effort, and beyond that, if the people that redo it overlook things like that that thing about the descent, heat, temperature, it'll be all gone. So I jumped up. I said, Mr. Lowe, if you will consider all we presented to you, you'd know that it is a waste of time to redo everything. And I just walked out. And that caused a bit of a stir, believe me, because one of my friends in the Flight Crew Support Division, Dale Newsman, he's passed on a few years ago. Flight Crew Support Division was a wonderful group. All these things I've shared to you, they'd go through every single thing, every single alarm to make sure that everything was done right, to let the crew know what was right and what wasn't. And Dale had worked with me and saw all the things we did. And Dale and those group of guys from Flight Crew Support they said, Jerry's right. Jerry's died. They've done a thorough job. And they never did change anything. All the changes we made, they're in the Apollo Experience Report. If you don't believe it, here again, go Google my name, Jerry Woodfill, and look for Apollo Experience Report warning system. And they all got in there, including all of these things I'm telling you right now. So that's when I spoke up.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jerry. I'm afraid that is all the time we've got for questions for now. So thank you again for everything this evening. It is time for us now to say goodbye, and it's been a pleasure having you join us tonight. So this is a goodbye from all of us here at Boundless.
Well, bye-bye, and I wish you Godspeed, everyone that watched me. Thank you for watching.
So if you missed any of tonight's talk, you can replay the whole event on this webpage once the session is finished as many times as you like. But don't forget, to see more of our great events, be sure to check out the Boundless events page at www.boundless.co.uk/events. Here you'll be able to register for our upcoming events, including a talk with Rob Janer from Silverstone, as we dig deep into the rich archives of the home of British motorsport in February. And in March, we host an evening with Hollywood stuntman Jim Dowdle, taking us behind the scenes on some of the greatest action and adventure films of the last 50 years. We will also shortly be sending you a feedback form. It'd be great if you could take a few minutes to fill it out and help us shape the future of our online events. Thank you for attending tonight, and we really look forward to seeing you at the next event.